Greetings, this is Dr. Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul's Missionary Baptist Church located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. Recently, a movie came out about a week or so ago called 1917. 1917 talks about the war that occurred, and I think it's really, really interesting that this movie came out, and The reason I'm saying this is because all these things are tied in. If you've been following me and I've been talking about the New World Order, One World Governmental System, I talk about how the international bankers are instrumental in a lot of these things. And I also I've been talking about communism and socialism and its impact on things. I've also been telling you about how these strategies that are being employed and affecting things worldwide were actually perfected in Germany and in what's known as Eastern Europe. And so anyway, let me tell you a little bit about. Let me go back through and lay the foundation so I can tell you. Now, one of the things that we find out through what was known as the Church Commission. The Church Commission was a series of hearings back in the 1970s in Congress, and there was a couple of topics that they talked about. One of them was in particular, they talked about how the media many times has been used as an arm of the CIA for propaganda purposes. Now, there was a act that was passed in the 1940s. I can't remember exactly what it's called right now. But anyway, the act, it allowed for the use of propaganda by the United States government, more specifically the CIA, which it was the OSS was created, and it was the forerunner to what is known as the CIA. And so the CIA is basically a spy organization, right? They operate in intrigue and they have spies and double agents and all that other stuff, just like the stuff in the movie. And this is all public record, so it's not like I'm making something up. But in any event, the CIA was created, but one of the laws that was passed stated that even though they were allowed to use propaganda to promote their ideologies and their agendas, but that propaganda was not supposed to be able to be used against the American citizens. So what they did is they participated in propaganda in foreign countries using their media in order to promote basically the agenda for America, the diplomacy, the policies around America. So they were allowed to do that, and they took that from the Germans, the Nazis, Joseph Goebbels, who was the minister of propaganda, and Adolf Hitler, who originally they started to perfect the use of propaganda in order to promote their ideologies and to help to set their foreign policy, right, and how they interact with foreign nations. So Hitler started it, Joseph Goebbels took over, and so at the end of World War II, the Americans captured many of the Nazi scientists and many of the leaders in the Nazi Party, and they brought them to America, and they learned from them, and they took a lot of their actual strategies that they used. One of them in particular was the use of propaganda through the media. Now, Edward Bernays is known as the modern founder of propaganda, and he was a nephew to I think it was either Hitler or one of those guys, but he was from Germany. He perfected the use of propaganda. Now they call it public relations, but propaganda is how you get people to you kind of manipulate information in a way to get people to line up with your views or your opinions or to accept your agenda. For lack of a better term. So during the time of the Nazis, they used propaganda in the media. They used pictures and posters. They used movies and actors and all those things in order to promote their ideology. So whether it was them promoting the idea that the Jews in Germany were inferior and they were terrible people, or whether it was Hitler trying to promote the idea of the German Uberman or Superman, as they called him. All these ideas were things that they held to, that they used propaganda to promote that. So the Americans capture them at the end of World War II. They bring them over here, and they begin to use that in a way that in order to promote their agenda, promote their ideology. So you had this the Church Commission in the 1970s where they went before Congress and there was a set of hearings. And during the hearings, the CIA and some of the other intelligence agencies admitted that they used propaganda even on the American people. And if you get a chance to look up the Church Commission, a lot of the video footage of the actual hearings are there and you can listen to them. It's declassified government documents, so it's not like I'm saying something that's not verifiable or something that is speculation. These are things that actually happen. So in the hearings, they admitted that the CIA used propaganda in major media. So newspapers, which was very popular back in the 70s, Hollywood movie studios, all the major networks, and a cross-section of media people were actually CIA plants that they would give them stories to publish. And those stories were meant to frame public opinion and shape public opinion in a way that got them to accept their narrative, which helped them to promote their agenda. So, for instance, going to war. In the 1960s, you actually had what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the media reported that a Vietnamese ship fired on an American ship. And they used that information to gain public opinion, to sway public opinion to get public acceptance of us going to war in Vietnam. Admiral Robert McNamara, who was a former admiral, is reported to have admitted that this was false. It was called a false flag. So they admitted that this never happened, but when they used the story, the American public was so outraged that they were okay with us sending troops over into Vietnam. There's other instances that has been used throughout, and they have admitted to many of these things that when they publish these stories, it is to sway public opinion for them to be able to promote their ideas. And in Nazi Germany, they used propaganda and the media in order to get the German people to accept them going to war and even support it. And so that was why it was so important. And likewise, during the time of Vietnam, the media was also used to also sway public opinion back in order for the American public. There was a lot of riots and protests because of the disagreement with the war in Vietnam. So anyway, you have this Church Commission. The Church Commission admits that this is what happens in the media, that they use movie studios, and even to the place where they would actually supply scripts to movie studios, and a lot of those scripts were things that were actually happening. They would try to frame or shape the story, things that the CIA was doing, the government was doing, had done in the past, or was planning to do in the future. And so that's how they used propaganda in order to shape public opinion. So I say all that to say, this movie 1917 comes out, and this movie 1917 really is interesting. I haven't seen the movie yet, but the year 1917 is a very important and interesting time in world history for a couple of different reasons. So, if you please subscribe to the YouTube channel, please share my videos, my teachings as much as possible. But here's what was reported. So during the time of the Civil War, even before then, and I've written on this, I've done reports on this and studies. It was clear that one of the things that happened is the international bankers consistently tried to gain a foothold here in America in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and there was times where they would actually have a what's called a the International Bank. The International Bank, which is the Rothschild Bank, the World Bank, if you will, they would actually have a bank here, and they would pass an act. But then, at least 2 times before that, they the charter or the permission to have the International Bank here in America had expired, and they removed them from America. And so they were trying to get the international banks back here in America. And during the time of Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln rejected it. He didn't allow it to happen. And so it's well reported and believed that was also a major cause of the Civil War. And how do I tie these things in together? A lot of people will say slavery was the primary topic or the primary issue that they were dealing with. And although slavery was a big issue, I want to put it in its proper context, that the slave trade was based on economics and wealth building, colonization. It was based on those things more so than race. When the slave trade started, which was indentured servitude originally, it was started because of companies and businesses that were coming to the New World, which is here in America, North America. They were coming here, and they were, especially a lot of the agricultural ones, they had all this land to farm, but they didn't have enough workers. So they started to pay people's transit from Europe, initially from Europe over here. The people would come over here, they would work for a certain period of time as indentured servants, and then after their charter was over, they were able to purchase their freedom. So, for instance, it was usually a 5 to 7 year window where, these companies came over, especially the ones that had a lot of land, and they would bring these indentured servants over here, and then they would be able to purchase their freedom. African immigrants were in the mix as well. So you had Irish and other Europeans, and then you had Africans as well. They were indentured servitudes originally, but then a shift occurred in the late 1600s, I meant to say, where they transitioned from indentured servitude to chattel slavery. And chattel slavery, which means that person was no longer, it was a piece of property. They were considered pieces of property, and their children, if a woman was a slave, then her children, if she was in chattel slavery and she was a slave, if she had children, her children were also considered property as well. So that transition happened in the late 1600s, and it primarily focused on people of African descent. Now, the word, for people that don't know, slavery is a very ancient practice, and the word slave comes from the word Slav or Slavic. So the Slavic people are from Europe. So slavery was very prominent in Europe for many centuries. And so when we understand the fact that it wasn't relegated or focused just on black people, but in the late 1600s they transitioned, and another fact that a lot of people don't know, the first slave owner of a chattel slave black person was a black man by the name of Anthony Johnson. And history doesn't really talk a lot about that, which I understand why. But ultimately, when we need to look at the overall thing, and I'm going to bring this full circle, getting back to 1917. Okay, so you had this transition in the late 1600s from indentured servitude to chattel slavery. The focus was primarily on people from Africa, black people, considered black people. Now you fast forward it, you get to the end of the Civil War, right, or during the time of the Civil War, and you had this Civil War that's about to take place between the North and the South. Now, again, going back to, and I need to stress this for people to understand, and the reason it's important to understand is because a lot of times when we try to debate or to talk or to, come through these issues of slavery, we do it from an emotional standpoint. So we all acknowledge that slavery was wrong. Treating another human being as property is bad, right? We all acknowledge that. But when you leave the argument or the debate in the emotional place, you can't really come to a resolution. And when I say resolution, a lot of people are arguing for reparations now. And because they're doing it from a place of revenge and they're not logically and, historically and financially breaking the topic down, we'll kind of lose the overall effectiveness of the argument, because it's hard to really qualify or quantify, I should say. It's hard to quantify what's happening, and it's hard to really bring it to a resolution. So it was the international bankers that really helped to fund the slave trade, whether it's the shipping industry or whether it's the slave trading or those type of things, right? So the international bankers, which is the Rothschild Bank that originated in England, they had a lot of influence in the worldwide slave trade. They wanted to have the right to be able to practice here. Also, they're also known as the central banks, the international banks, the World Bank, or the central bank, right? So they wanted to come here, and America allowed them for a period of time, and then they would remove their charter, and they were no longer able to practice the slave trade. Now, when you look at the Rothschild, there was there was a quote of one of the Rothschild bankers who talked about the money supply, right? So one of the things that the central bank does is they control money supplies, and one of the Rothschild patriarchs was quoted as saying, "I don't care who writes the laws. If you give me control of the money supply, I can control a nation." And so because they understood the Rothschild, they understood how they manipulated economies and manipulated nations, that they were, Americans knew their history, and so they rejected them coming here. Now, just another piece of information, the Rothschild family in Europe, they were very, I'll tell you a couple of ways that they gained a lot of wealth, and they were able to gain a lot of control as well. So you had the Rothschild family. You had Meyer Amschel Rothschild. His name was Bauer. They changed it to Rothschild, which means red shield. He came up with this concept in these European monarchs. And what the European monarchs would do is they would travel, and they would have their gold or their precious, possessions with them, for wealth. And so they would travel through Europe. So if you were in Germany and you were going to England or France or one of those places, you ran the risk of getting hijacked with all your treasure and with all your wealth. So they came up with this idea that the Rothschilds would hold a deposit of their gold or precious stone metals or whatever the case may be, and they would give them a certificate of deposit. So then they would go from, say, if I traveled from Germany and went to England, there was a Rothschild bank. One of his sons, he had 5 sons, and they set up central banks in 5 different nations in Europe, and one of them was Great Britain. And so if I went from Germany and I deposited my gold in the bank, Rothschild Bank, central bank in Germany, when I go to Great Britain, instead of me having to carry all my gold, I have this certificate of deposit. I can go to the Rothschild Bank there, and then I could withdraw, resources or whatever I needed, right? So that was how they started to do that. They also, another way that they gain wealth. So anyway, they started that process, and then they started to use what was known as fractional lending. And fractional lending is, which banks use now today, is they will loan up to 10 times the amount of actual value that they have in the bank. So, for instance, if I had $1 million worth of gold in my bank, they would loan out up to $10 million and charge interest to other people that want to take out a loan for whatever reason. That's what banks do nowadays, which is why they always test the health of the banks, and they have these different tests that they do because they do fractionalized lending. And so banks aren't required to have the entire amount of what they loan out or the deposits that the people give. So if you went and put $1 million in the bank, chances are you couldn't just go to the bank and tell them, I want $1 million in cash. You couldn't do that. They wouldn't allow you to do that. If you were to do that, you would have to let them know ahead of time. They would have to call the Federal Reserve or wherever, and they would have to get money shipped to them to give it to you. And then you'd probably have to answer a lot of questions. But anyway, one of the ways that the Rothschilds became famous is during the time of Napoleon and the war in France, there was they would sell war bonds. So they would sell war bonds, which meant that they would loan money to nations to fund their war efforts. I'm going to say that again. They would lend money to nations for the nations to be able to fight a war. And they got so clever that they actually started loaning money to both sides of the war, so it didn't matter who won the war, they won either way. But one in particular, during the time of the Napoleon and I think it was the French Revolution, is there was a courier that had information or notification that Napoleon had won the war. And because Great Britain, and I'm kind of paraphrasing what happened, so please forgive me, the people in Great Britain was afraid of what was happening, and so they withdrew their money from the institutions in Great Britain. But it wasn't true. Napoleon actually had lost the war. And so because people had pulled all their money out of the economy, the bonds were very cheap. And because the Rothschilds knew that that wasn't true, they went in and bought the bonds at a very low price. And then when the real information came that Napoleon had lost, the value of the bond skyrocketed. Now, this is important because that's how they made money. Not only did they make money by lending money to nations in order to go to war, but they also started to kind of decide the outcomes or report the outcomes. And that's an early form of propaganda, right? People believed something that wasn't true, but that helped to push their agenda, and they profited from it. So again, the same system, because the people, the founding fathers, knew some of the history of these people, they rejected them from coming into the nation. They rejected them from coming into America. Lincoln, in particular, was very leery of them, and he pushed to keep them from being able to come and have a central bank in the United States. And because of that, it is believed that they helped to fan the flames of war, because you got to realize that they were making a lot of money in the slave trade, and they were making a lot of money in the South, right? They were making a lot of money in the South, and many millionaires and many corporations, many families, it was primarily families and many corporations, accumulated a lot of wealth because of the chattel slavery trade, right? So because of that, they wanted to make sure that slavery continued. And now you have the people in the North and the abolitionists that are pushing against this. And Lincoln takes on the mantle of being an anti-slave guy, wants to push the Emancipation Proclamation, or take away the states' rights to have slavery, what they started doing in the North. And so basically the globalists, the international bankers, wage war on Lincoln as well. So now they're going to war, and the South versus the North, but the bankers wanted to loan money to Lincoln for their war efforts, but they were going to charge very high interest rate. And so because they wanted to charge a very high interest rate, Abraham Lincoln rejected it. He said no, he didn't want to borrow the money. So they threatened Lincoln that if he didn't borrow the money, that they were going to send France or one other nation to help the South, and they would, of course, defeated the North. They would have continued to perpetuate chattel slavery, and they would have been able to bring the central banks here to the United States of America. Now, when this happened, Lincoln had created an ally in Russia. So in this time, you had the czars in Russia, which is pretty much a monarchy or whatever. So the Russian czars come on side of Lincoln in the North, and they say to the international bankers that if you send France or one of those other nations to help the South, we're going to help the North. And Russia was a very strong powerhouse back then. So now, of course, the international bankers didn't send in France or any other nation to help the South. The North wins, and the international bankers get denied a charter to come to the United States. And then afterwards, which many people believe, and historically there's a lot of evidence to back up this claim, possibly, that the international bankers had Lincoln killed, because many people say that John Wilkes Booth was a high-level Freemason, and the international bankers, are involved with Freemasonry and secret societies and all that other stuff, and all this stuff is believable. So they have Lincoln killed, and an interesting thing happened. That was in the 1860s, right? A couple decades later, you have in 1913 what is known as the Federal Reserve Act. In 1913, on Jekyll Island in the United States, I think it's off the coast of Georgia, that some congressmen gathered together in the evening, and it was kind of under the radar. They passed the Federal Reserve Act, which allowed the central banks to come to the United States. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and how that actually was implemented in the 1930s after the stock market crash of 1929, which a lot of people believe that the international bankers had something to do with because they manipulated the market. And what happened is they used propaganda. In 1929, the stock market crashed. They used propaganda to instill fear in the people. There was a run on the banks, which, of course, like I talked about, fractional lending that the banks use, that if everybody goes to the bank at once and tries to withdraw their money, it will cause a crash in the economy because the banks don't have that money. And they put in safeguards since then that you can't do that. They won't allow you to do that. But back then, obviously, they didn't have it, right? So anyway, 1913, they passed the Federal Reserve Act. 1917, you have the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrows the czars in Russia, and it helps to put the communists in power in Russia in 1917. And, of course, communism is one of the tools of the international bankers in order to get world power. And so it's interesting. I say all that to say it's very interesting that this movie 1917 is coming out now, because one of the things that happened in the Bolshevik Revolution is Ukraine was involved. And so I thought that was very interesting because of the fact that, during the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, I'm looking through my notes here. And the Russian Revolution was a period of political and social revolution across the territory of the Russian Empire, commencing with the abolition of the monarchy in 1917 and concluding in 1923 after the Bolshevik establishment of the Soviet Union, including national states of Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and others, and end of the Civil War in Russia. So Ukraine was one of the nations that was caught up when the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia, and that was in 1917 when it started. 1918 they killed the czars in Russia, and from then on communism took over in Russia, and then you had the Soviet Union, which engulfed a lot of states within it. But this all happened. So these. Now, when we look at what's in the news, right? So there's this big push against Russia, which it's reported also that Russia has pushed out the central banks once again. There's no longer a central bank in Russia. Putin pushed them out, which every time that happens, of course, that leader becomes public enemy number one. What they do in the media is they make that person the big boogeyman. And this is not for or against Putin. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just talking about from a historical standpoint what has happened. Just like in Libya and Gaddafi. I was talking to someone earlier today about Libya. And Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi, who was the head of Libya, and that's one of the oil nations. And soon, a little bit before Gaddafi was actually murdered and assassinated, he began to publicly tell the other OPEC nations, because right now in the world, crude oil is traded, which is one of the most valuable commodities on the planet, is traded only using United States dollars. You can only trade in dollars. It doesn't matter if you're in China, if you're in Russia, if you're in Africa or Asia. If you purchase crude oil on the international market, it's only traded in dollars. So Muammar Gaddafi began to encourage the other OPEC nations, oil-producing nations, to begin to trade crude oil using their own currency, because it's their oil. And so he began to encourage that. And so soon after that, he was marked for death. He became public enemy number one. And, of course, we know that he got assassinated. So this is one of the patterns that always happen. Whenever, when he deals with the international bankers, whenever their money is affected, that's when you see things happening. There's a book called Confessions of an International Assassin. I have a copy of that book. And in the book, the gentleman who was formerly working for the CIA, he talked about how the CIA, in conjunction with the international bankers, how they do things. So they put a lot of leaders in place. So it was reported like Manuel Noriega in Panama, some of the other people, they put them in place, right? They are actually planted by the CIA on the international thing, and they have to do, their bidding. And whenever they get to a place where they no longer cooperate with their agenda, that's when they're targeted. And so here's what the report says, and I'm paraphrasing. He said they put these leaders in place. If the leader doesn't cooperate, the first thing they do is they loan these nations a lot of money. So they're indebted to the international bankers. And like the Bible says, the borrower is subservient to the lender. So now they're under obligation to the international bankers, and then they begin to call the shots. And most of the time, after this big loan is made, these multinational corporations come in, they steal the resources of the land, and the people that live in those nations are poor, like in Venezuela. Venezuela is oil rich, but yet the people were so poor that was rioting in the streets for lack of resources. Again, talking about these oil nations as well. Many of these nations that are rich with oil, but the average everyday person doesn't have, a lot of stuff. So anyway, they send them in. They loan them money. When the leader begins to reject them or not, go along with their agenda, they first they bribe them, and then they paint a picture as to them being a horrible dictator, totalitarian fascist or whatever they paint the picture. If that doesn't work, they try to assassinate them, and then when they're not assassinated, when the assassination attempt does not work, then they send in the army, and a lot of times it's the United States Army that they send in, which is what has happened historically, right? So Vietnam at the time where we were in Vietnam, one of the major things that was being produced in Vietnam was opium, right? Poppy seeds. We're in Afghanistan now. Right now, Afghanistan is the number one producer of opioids through poppy. They have poppy fields. We were in South America with the Sandinistas and the and all those other people in South America. In South America, cocaine comes from there. So you had the big boom in the 80s and 90s with cocaine in America. So these things are historically, it's and a lot of the stuff I'm saying, I'm telling you theories that are out there. A lot of the stuff I'm telling you is documented, and whether it's declassified documents or very well written reports that we come across. But all these things happen, and it shouldn't be a surprise, because the Bible tells us very clearly that in the last days men's thoughts will be continually evil. The Bible tells us that the love of money is the root of all evil, and the Bible tells us that this one world system that happens in the end comes into play, and we know that we're moving towards that, and that one world system makes war with the Lamb of God, which is Jesus, who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And so this Antichrist spirit, one world governmental system that is trying to move forward, we see all the signs that it is moving forward. We see the historical patterns of how these things happen over and over again. And so we just have to be mindful and have our eyes open and our ears attuned to what is happening. Don't be, as the Bible says, don't allow the enemy to gain the advantage of you, because we are not ignorant of his devices. This has been Dr. Joe Green. Until next time, peace and blessings to you, and shalom.